The cameras rolled as Lydia Carmichael leaned in, her signature smirk in place. This was her element: live television, an engaged audience, and a controversy she could milk for attention. Tonight, her target was an easy one. "Melania Trump," she began, dragging out the name with deliberate emphasis. "The former First Lady who spent 4 years pretending to care has re-emerged in the public eye. But let's be honest, what did she actually do?" She paused for dramatic effect, flipping through her notes with exaggerated disinterest. "Besides pose for photos and decorate the White House with those nightmare-fuel Christmas trees?" A few scattered chuckles rippled through the studio, and Lydia felt a surge of satisfaction. The audience was on her side, exactly where she wanted them. Encouraged, she leaned in further. "I mean, really, was she anything more than a silent mannequin standing beside a man known for his, let's call it, colorful personality?" The laughter grew, louder this time, as Lydia basked in the moment. This was her craft. Mockery, derision, the kind of late-night commentary that social media loved. Then, suddenly, her phone vibrated. She ignored it at first, determined to keep her rhythm, but then another notification flashed across the screen, in front of her. Then another. Something was happening. Her stomach tightened. She glanced down briefly, her breath catching when she saw the words "Donald J. Trump has responded." "Live." The smirk faltered, but she masked it quickly, tapping the "yeah" screen. As her eyes scanned the message, the air seemed to shift. The audience, once lively, now sat in stunned silence. Lydia Carmichael is a low-IQ, third-rate hack who wouldn't know class if it hit her in the face. Melania is 1,000 times the woman she'll ever be, graceful, kind, and admired by millions. Unlike Lydia, she doesn't need to insult others to stay relevant. Sad. Lydia felt her fingers tremble slightly. She let out a forced laugh, attempting to dismiss the tension. "Well," she said, her voice struggling for its usual confidence, "Trump does love his insults, doesn't he?" A weak chuckle escaped, but this time, no one in the audience joined in. The atmosphere in the studio had changed completely. The energy, once so in her favor, now felt unstable, unpredictable. Her phone continued to vibrate furiously. Social media was erupting. She glanced at the studio monitors. Her name was trending, but not in the way she had hoped. Melania Trump was at the top of the charts. Supporters were flooding the internet, defending the former First Lady with an intensity that took Lydia by surprise. Clips of her remarks were being dissected alongside Trump's scathing rebuke. Her earpiece crackled. The voice of her producer, sharp and urgent, sent a chill down her spine. "Lydia, we have a problem." She swallowed hard, her throat suddenly dry. This wasn't how the night was supposed to go. She had planned to mock Melania, to generate a viral moment at her expense. Instead, the backlash was instant and worse. It was growing. She looked up at the camera, suddenly aware that millions were watching her reaction. Her carefully curated confidence was slipping. The smirk that had carried her through so many broadcasts was gone. She had become the story, and not in the way she had ever wanted. Lydia shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her mind racing. This wasn't just online backlash, it was turning into a firestorm. Her producer's voice came through her earpiece again, more urgent this time. "Lydia, we're getting flooded with calls. Sponsors are watching. Executives want a meeting after the show. Tread carefully." She clenched her jaw, forcing herself to maintain composure. "All right," she muttered under her breath, straightening her posture. She wasn't going to let Trump rattle her. She had been in tough spots before. This was just another moment to navigate. Looking back at the camera, she plastered on a thin smile. "Well, folks, it looks like the former president is watching," she said, trying to sound unfazed. "Nice to know he still has time between his golf games to tweet about me." A few chuckles came, but they were sparse. The audience's energy was different now, hesitant, cautious. She could feel it slipping through her fingers. The teleprompter continued rolling, but she barely registered the next segment. Her phone was lighting up with texts, some from colleagues, others from higher-ups at the network. Some were warnings, Others condolences, and then she saw the emails, advertisers reconsidering placement. Need to discuss damage control. Urgent. Board wants a statement. Her stomach twisted. This wasn't just a momentary social media flare-up, it was bigger. Her producer spoke again, his voice low but firm. We need a response, fast. She took a slow breath, her mind scrambling for the right move. If she doubled down, she risked further backlash. If she backtracked, she looked weak. This was not how tonight was supposed to go. Just hours ago, she had rehearsed her monologue with confidence, expecting applause, viral clips, and headlines praising her wit. Instead, she was watching everything spiral out of control in real time. Another notification flashed on her screen. This time, it wasn't just Trump. Conservative commentators, political figures, even former White House staffers were chiming, and some called her disgraceful. Others mocked her attempt at humor, but the worst part? Even neutral voices, journalists she had once considered allies, were questioning whether she had crossed a line. The weight of it all pressed on her chest. This wasn't just about Melania Trump anymore. It was about her credibility, her career, her future in this industry. She glanced at the camera, realizing her silence had stretched a little too long. The audience was waiting. The world was waiting. She swallowed hard. There was no easy way out of this. Lydia. Her producer's voice came one last time, sharp and final. Choose your next words carefully. Her hands gripped the desk. And then she spoke. Lydia took a deep breath, forcing herself to stay composed. The cameras were still rolling, millions were watching, and every second of hesitation was making her look weaker. She knew she had to say something, but what? Should she double down? Defend her remarks and claim it was just satire? Or should she pivot, issue a half-hearted clarification and try to move on? She licked her lips, her voice steady but slightly strained. Well, it seems I've struck a nerve, she said, her attempt at humor falling flat. Look, I make jokes, that's my job. If people are offended, well, I guess that's just how things go these days, isn't it? Silence. No laughs, no cheers. Just an awkward, lingering stillness that made her stomach knot. Then another notification flashed on the screen, this one from a major sponsor. Pulling their ad placement. Her heart pounded. She wasn't just trending, she was unraveling in real time. The control room was in chaos, producers scrambling, phones ringing off the hook. A network executive was already on the way to her dressing room, and she knew what that meant. Damage control. Or worse. Lydia, wrap this up. Her producer hissed in her earpiece. She swallowed. Listen, folks, she said, her voice slightly softer now. I may have been a little harsh earlier, but I stand by my right to speak my mind, just as everyone else does. That's what makes this country great, right? A few claps, hesitant and scattered. It wasn't enough. The show cut to commercial, and the moment the red light on the camera dimmed, Lydia exhaled sharply. She reached for her phone, fingers shaking slightly as she scrolled through the flood of headlines. Lydia Carmichael faces backlash for Melania Trump remarks. Trump's response leaves TV host stunned. Network silent amid calls for apology or firing. The dressing room door burst open. Her producer stood there looking grim. The higher-ups. Want you to issue a real apology, he said, not bothering with pleasantries. And they mean real. No sarcasm, no dodging. Just own it. Lydia bristled. Apologize? For what? For doing my job? The producer sighed, rubbing his temples. Lydia, this isn't just some internet spat. We're losing sponsors. Affiliates are getting calls to drop the show and executives are panicking. You either fix this or... He let the words hang in the air, but she knew what he meant. She had a choice. Go down fighting, stand her ground, and risk everything, or swallow her pride and try to salvage what was left. She glanced at her phone one more time, at the endless flood of comments tearing her apart. Then she looked in the mirror, at the woman who had once been untouchable in this industry. She had spent years building her career. One segment, one moment, had put it all on the line. With a deep breath, she turned to her producer. "Fine," she said, her voice quieter now. "I'll do it." And just like that, Lydia Carmichael, who had built her brand on never backing down, was about to issue the one thing she had sworn she never would: an apology. Lydia sat in the dimly lit dressing room staring at her reflection. The makeup team had left. The laughter from the studio audience had faded, and now all that remained was the weight of what she had to do. Her phone continued to vibrate on the counter, messages pouring in from friends, critics, and colleagues alike. Some urged her to stand firm, to refuse to cave to mob pressure. Others warned her that if she didn't act fast, she might not have a career by morning. A sharp knock on the door made her jump. Her producer stepped in, his expression unreadable. "It's time." She let out a slow breath, nodded, and stood. The network had arranged for a live statement. No pre-recorded video, no carefully edited PR release, just Lydia, the camera, and a nation waiting to see if she would bend or break. As she stepped back onto the set, the energy was different now. No applause, no warmth, just cold professionalism. The cameras locked onto her and the countdown began. 3, 2, 1. She took a breath, forcing her voice to stay steady. "I want to take a moment to address my comments from earlier this evening regarding former First Lady Melania Trump," she began. "I recognize that my words may have come across as disrespectful, and that was not my intention." Her producer gave her a small nod from behind the camera. So far, so good. "I believe in free speech, in holding public figures accountable, and in political satire," she continued. "But I also believe in fairness. And after reflecting on my words, I understand why many people, whether they support the Trumps or not, felt that I crossed a line." Her throat felt dry, but she pushed through. "Melania Trump was the First Lady of the United States. She has her supporters, her critics, and like anyone in the public eye, she is subject to discussion. But personal attacks aren't necessary to have that discussion. I regret the way I framed my words tonight, and I apologize to those who were offended." Silence. Then the control room switched the feed to commercial. The second the cameras went off, Lydia exhaled sharply, her shoulders sagging. Her producer gave her a tight-lipped nod. "That'll do," he said. But as she checked her phone, scrolling through the initial reactions, she wasn't so sure. Some praised her for taking responsibility. Others saw it as forced, insincere. Trump supporters mocked her, calling it a weak backpedal. And then there was the worst part, her own audience. The people who had cheered her on, who had loved her fearless commentary, they were turning on her. Lydia sold out. She caved to pressure. Disappointing. I thought she was stronger than this. She set the phone down, staring at the studio. Walls as a new, chilling thought settled in. She had done what the network asked. She had given the apology. But had she just lost everything anyway? Lydia sat frozen in her chair long after the cameras stopped rolling. The quiet hum of the studio equipment filled the air, but inside her mind, a storm was raging. Had she just saved her career, or had she sealed her downfall? Her producer stood by, waiting for some kind of response from her, but she had nothing left to say. She had done what they wanted. She had bent the knee. And yet, the gnawing pit in her stomach told her that it wasn't enough. Not for the network, not for the public, and certainly not for the people who had once championed her boldness. Her phone buzzed again. Reluctantly, she picked it up. Breaking. Lydia Carmichael's apology backfires. Both sides furious. She clenched her jaw, her pulse quickening as she scrolled through the headlines. The right was celebrating her humiliation, mocking her for being forced to grovel. The left, her supposed base, was furious that she had caved at all. Spineless. She had nothing to apologize for. Trump played her like a fiddle. The worst part? Her sponsors hadn't started crawling back. The network was still uneasy. Her so-called damage control had only thrown her into a deeper mess. One, where she was neither the fearless commentator she once was, nor the reformed media figure the executives hoped she'd become. "Well," her producer finally said, breaking the silence. "That's done." Lydia scoffed. Is it? He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. We did what we could. You said what needed to be said. But it wasn't enough, she muttered, staring at the flickering studio lights. They wanted blood, and they got it. The producer hesitated, then lowered his voice. Look, off the record, I don't know what's next for you. The network's gonna have meetings. Sponsors are still nervous. It's 50-50 right now. She exhaled, sharply, her grip tightening around her phone. So I could still get fired? He didn't answer. He didn't have to. A cold realization settled in. This was bigger than just one bad segment. It was a shift. The industry thrived on controversy, but only when it benefited them. When she was attacking the right, they cheered her on. The moment she became the target, they distanced themselves, let her take the fall. She had played the game for years, but tonight she had lost. With a hollow laugh, she grabbed her coat. If they're gonna fire me, they should at least have the guts to do it to my face. She stormed toward the exit, ignoring the flashing notifications, the frantic messages from PR reps telling her to lay low. As she pushed open the studio doors, into the cold night air, one final thought lingered in her mind. She had built her career tearing people down. Tonight, she had been on the receiving end. And for the first time in her life, Lydia Carmichael didn't know what came next. Lydia stepped onto the cold pavement outside the studio, the weight of uncertainty pressing on her shoulders. The city hummed around her, cars honking, distant chatter, but it all felt muted, like she was trapped inside a soundproof bubble. She checked her phone again against her better judgment. The backlash wasn't slowing down. If anything, it was growing. Carmichael's career is done. Apologized and still got torched. Weak. When will these media hacks learn? Trump always wins. Her fingers curled around the device before she shoved it into her pocket. For years, she had been the one driving the conversation, setting the narrative. Now she was the headline, and not in the way she had ever wanted. As she approached her car, another notification popped up. This one wasn't from the media or social media trolls. It was from the network.board meeting scheduled for tomorrow morning. Attendance required. Her stomach twisted. That was it. The decision on her future was coming, and it wasn't going to wait. A voice called out from behind her. Lydia. She turned, spotting a junior producer from the show jogging toward her, his breath visible in the cold night air. Listen, I probably shouldn't be telling you this, but I just heard from one of the execs, he said, lowering his voice. They're talking replacement. Sponsors are still pulling out, and the board is panicking. Lydia stiffened. So what? They're just going to cut me loose? The producer hesitated. They're weighing their options. Some of them think you should go on air again, make another statement. This time, more sincere. Maybe even a sit-down interview. She laughed bitterly. You mean grovel? Or, he continued, they might just decide you're too much of a liability and cut you loose now before it gets worse. Worse? How could it possibly get worse? She folded her arms, exhaling sharply. They built me up for years, and now, after one bad segment, they're ready to toss me? He hesitated, then shrugged. That's how it goes, right? Lydia clenched her jaw. He wasn't wrong. She had seen it happen to others before. She just never thought she'd be the one in the crosshairs. What would you do? She asked, surprising even herself. The producer sighed. If I were you, I'd make the decision before they do. Either double down and own it, or walk away on your own terms before they show you the door. Lydia considered his words as the cold wind whipped around her. She had spent years crafting her career, becoming the sharp-tongued media personality people either loved or loathed. Now it was all hanging by a thread. She had two choices. She could fight, go back on air, defend herself, call out the network for its hypocrisy and burn every bridge on her way out. Or she could play their game, issue another carefully worded statement, try to salvage what was left, and hope they'd let her stay. Neither option felt good, but one thing was clear. Lydia Carmichael was no longer in control of her own fate, and for the first time in her career she had no idea what tomorrow would bring.